Okay, so I'm going to talk about the instincts. What are the instincts? Are they priorities? No, they're not priorities. They're instincts. I think that people study study them as priorities and think that you just rank the things that matter to you, and that's what it is. And it's just not what it is. Um, let's look at the definition of what an instinct is. It's look for two things. One is a drive, an innate propensity for action. So look for action. Look for people taking steps in this domain. The other thing is look for proficiency, a talent, an underlying ability, or a knack. So look for those. Look for instinct. Again, not priorities, not life priorities of, if you like food or money, if you like sex, if you and sexual instinct, chemistry, and losing yourself in something completely, and so on and so forth, or the social, where you're connected to groups and cultures and define them and then rank the things you care about. Don't do that. That's not going to get you the right answer because, first of all, those can change throughout your life. What I want when I'm 18 years old is completely different from what I want now. It's in my late 30s. Now that I've been married, that I've acquired wealth and had many jobs and had a kid, it's my goals, my priorities are going to be completely different. Your instincts, they don't change because they're more fundamental. They're on a deeper level. They're something a bit more unconscious. So you have to watch yourself more. The Enneagram is it's all about watching yourself. It's about stepping outside of yourself and observing what you find yourself doing automatically. This goes for both type and instinct. So for myself personally, I watch myself doing social things and compulsively. And I also look for a knack and an innate talent. I was a member of dozens of groups when I was on Facebook. Extremely hard to get into groups where I had to take tests and there were admissions, and these persisted even when I was single, when I was struggling, wanting a relationship, wanting sex and love and romance more than anything. But I couldn't get it, and the actions I was taking towards getting SX were not particularly consistent. They were not that effective, and they were not, highly self-aware. There's much more nuance in the dominant. So you actually in some ways you become more neurotic because you're thinking about it so much. But it does more than it needs to do for that particular goal. So it's a little bit complicated. It's like you worry about it more in some ways to the point where you're better at it than you need to be, and it leads to a greater skill. With a sexual first subtype, I don't just look for somebody that loves relationships and potentially has intense relationships, but somebody who can get into them more quickly, has an intuitive ability to understand how to attract people and what somebody else needs and how to register that in real time and to really understand that dance in a much more subtle way. It's not something that just comes from somebody that says, hey, I love sex, romance, I like connecting with people. Honestly, that's all of us, because all of us are looking for somebody in our life that we can connect with. I think that there may be some correlations that, somebody higher in SO or SX maybe has more of a drive towards it, but I honestly feel like on a deeper level we all have that, and the drive isn't there as much. But if you ask people, often they still have an incredibly strong desire and preference for sex and intimate one-on-one relationships, even if they're, say, an SPSO. That's what they value, because, and likewise, I think you can find people that would rank self-preservation highly because we all need to survive and we all need money and food. And so looking at the priorities just doesn't work. It's not what they are. It's as simple as breaking the word down and the sentence structures down into what we're talking about here. The instinct is it's action, and it happens, and it's innate, and it's largely unconscious. So that's the first thing, is to figure out really what the stacking and the instincts are asking you for. Next is to know in particular what each one is. And although they're what they sound like, that's going to get you far, just knowing to apply instincts rather than life priorities. That's going to get you very far. But it's also good to know a little bit more nuance about what they are. And I think they're more all-encompassing. I think that the social instinct, it's not just friendships. It can also be like anything learned. It's more on a basic level. Like SP is very much survival, practical stuff, that you just kind of have an impulse to take care of the bills quickly because there they are, and there's a moving into action of this needs being taken care of. It's all this basic stuff, and the self-preservation lasts just don't do it. I mean, I didn't go to the doctor or the dentist sometimes for many, many years, and had horrible health problems because I just didn't want to look at it, and you don't do it. The energy just doesn't flow there. And that's why it's not even placed in your stacking if you have it last. It doesn't mean I don't really care about that stuff often. For a long time, I was trying to find those things. You want health, you want money, you want stability and comfort and foundations. You want all of that stuff. Often you do want the last one. So I feel that's just not the way to accurately type yourself with your stacking. Notice what you do naturally and then even do too much of. Like, even when I was single for 4 years, 5 years, I still had friends, I still had a community, I had connection with people, I had an overabundance of those things. I didn't have a particularly good job, and I didn't have, my health wasn't great. I mean, I was basically sick mentally and physically, and and I didn't have a relationship per se. I had more of the SX stuff in place, I feel, but it's more important, I think, to get the dominant one correct. And I know there are going to be some people that say, well, dude, it's not about whether you're good at it or not. And I'm going to throw that back in their face and say, yes, it is. On some level, absolutely, yes, it is. Because it does need to do its job. It can't be like, hey, I'm awful at this, and I think about it all the time, but I'm awful at it, and I'm just miserable in this, unless, of course, you're looking in core type in a particular way. It's according also to the core type. So you have to look at it through the lens of your type. If you're a self-preservation 9, it can look like physical neglect, but it's beating self-preservation for you personally. There's often heavy comfort-seeking tendency, and these people may not look the most proficient in SP. They could be overweight, they could be underemployed, they could be lazy. That's 9, right? But their self-preservation is doing its job particular to them. So there has to be some alignment here with how these theoretical pieces work together. Otherwise, you're not looking at anything coherent. You're just looking at sentences and formulas that don't make sense, like looking at a math equation that is contradictory. So get it working for itself. Otherwise, they're loose and abstract and they don't actually apply. That's when you really are looking at a pseudoscience, when the definitions are not clear enough and you can't see action and functionality. It's just this vague abstract kind of, you could just apply a different stacking and make it fit. It shouldn't be that. It should really be functional. For me personally, to go back to what they are a little bit more deeply about what they are, not to skip the personal stuff for a second, but deeply about what they are. The self-preservation by Gurdjieff, if you go back to Gurdjieff, it was autonomic stuff in the body. It was so automatic. That was used as a metaphor by Naranjo, that it was stuff you literally don't even have to think about, that the SP is more instinctual, okay? And you'll just do it, and it's more functional than that. It's not like you just call up your friend to talk about stuff. That's usually not the SP instinct in action. It's you just pick the bill up and you pay the bill or whatever. It's more practical stuff that relates to self-preservation resources. Okay, and the social is more learned stuff. It was the motor center is what it was connected to, which is learned behaviors that you're not born with, that come from society, that you pick up on based on relationships, cultures, traditions, things you learn in school from your family. They're acquired skills, and that channels through the social instinct. So when you learn to play an instrument, or you learn to write, or you learn a particular way of moving or acting, that's very much the social instinct in motion. And then it becomes habit. Once it's ingrained, it then becomes habit. And often getting it into the habit space, it then moves into a more SP automatic space. Okay, and then the sexual instinct was the sex center, which, first of all, it has to do with sex, right? The genital, region of the body, the sexual part of the body, and intercourse and all of this, and masculinity, femininity, and gender, and all these things. But it also has to do with, attraction and energy and the procreative impulse. It's kind of, they say that the sexual instinct is kind of the just to talk about sex in general, they say sex is power. And the reason why some have said that it's power is because it literally is anti-death. This is a way of escaping death. This is how we propagate the species. But the sexual instinct is about all of that energy. It's the fastest moving, and that it's instantaneous. Think about how quickly you get turned on by something. It's immediate. It's right there. It's something that just happens. And, it's, for me, I honestly feel my social and sexual are close. But I sabotage myself because the sexual nuance just isn't there. I have messed things up with women I was literally trying to date or trying to pursue, just by being clumsy in that regard, by using more SO, basically, by acting quickly, by coming onto them quickly. Either I come onto them too quickly, or I come onto too many different people, and women get upset with me and go, "Oh, he talked to me too." It's like, okay, so that I'm sabotaging it, and the getting turned on, a lot of the stuff is there, but the nuance and the focus, the penetrating laser-like focus on, I want this woman, I want to make this work, and sticking with that and knowing how to do it, knowing what it involves, that comes from more of a sexual lead. And I've watched sexual first that are highly skilled at that. And they're not as social. I can talk to anybody, friendships, groups, I can make it happen. It's more in the action, movement, motor domain of learned behavior, and you got to go up there and talk to people and use language and communication, and it's much different. The sexual instinct is something that's more immediate, it's fast moving, you get turned on quickly, and you then have this exchange with one other person, because you can only have sex with one person at a time. So it tends to be more laser-like and nuanced and focused on that connection. So that's just kind of an overall way of looking at a number of things at once. I think that there's so many misunderstandings, but as I finish writing this book, it includes sections on the instincts as well. But the way, I haven't sat with my instincts for that long, believing I'm a social, but I'm pretty sure that it's correct now, and mistyping myself in the past as both self-preservation and sexual for extended periods leads me to see how it can happen and how it's more deeply wired. Look for what you're really good at. The social involves learned stuff and motion, and my greatest skills really are in learned stuff. I play a couple musical instruments, and I'm physical. I can do physical stuff in motion. That's type 8 stuff, but it's also like highly learned, coordinated physical motions. It's not just survival based stuff. It's more sophisticated cultural stuff, and that's where I start to look to see the motor domain into language and communication, as well as the arts. And then the more I looked for it, I saw it in the way I relate to people as well, in groups and socialization. So everything quickly started to fall in place there. That social was the way to go, and they're described as a more intellectual aid, and it's because literally the social instinct is that. If you look at how it's defined, it literally is that, and that's why the Enneagram is a language. You're using a language here to describe yourself. It's important for that language to work mathematically and logically as a formula. It's not just a pseudoscience. It's it's much more consistent than that. And it's simple and it's elegant, and if used properly, it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't mean your life is going to be a piece of cake and magically everything's going to fall in place, but it gives you more insight and gives you a place to work from. I think that, the times I was mistyped, which happened fumbling around with both instincts and type, I screwed things up for myself. Not that I didn't do it, when I was typed properly, but there was a correlation with pushing more of the right buttons with myself and other people. And the things that kept me mistyped were getting really hung up on egoic attachments, like thinking, no, I must be asexual because I'm sexually, passionate and possessive and all this stuff. It was like more of an ego attachment to it. Like, I want to be those things, or I want to be good at it, or it was an attractive thing that I valued. But it's not about your priorities. And when I looked at it and sat down with it, I was like, I've struggled with some relationships. I was single for extended periods. I do faux pas. Like, my ex, she told me, that you're not the most socially refined person. Like, that's not true. I am socially I am, but sexually there's something there that I missed the bus. I'm not the most chivalrous. There's a roughness to me, and the sexual, sometimes even the 8s, they know more how to push those buttons. I've seen it. I've talked to sexual 8s, and my brother's a good counterexample. He was in and out of relationships with women, and I think intuitively had a sense for how to do. With the 8, they have a more innate sense for how to do both surrender and possession sides of the equation. So there's that give and take, and they can kind of see what the person's asking for, and they are better at that power dance. Whereas if you take a social 8, and they essentially try to take social dynamics and to throw them into sexual romantic relationships, and they're using the wrong center, for the wrong center for that particular behavior, and they can sabotage it massively. I mean, you can end up with someone who is possessive, aggressive, and abusive, but in a way that they want to just see themselves as a totally good guy and a friend and this, that, and the other, because they're not seeing what's going on. They're not seeing that, the social 8s, they're still an 8, and they want power, lust, domination, as much as all the other 8s. They're just a little bit better at disguising it, and they use it more in a more socially, lubricated way. It's like they are more likely to be on good terms with people for friendship purposes, and that's because there's less exploitation of an individual person often, and there's more common goals at play there. They use the gang leader kind of metaphor for the social 8 because they're good at having everyone together and saying, well, all right, like, here we are. This is what we're doing. What are we doing, guys? We're hanging out. What do we have in common? What are our goals? They actually then become very, strong us versus them, violence against opposition and injustice type, because as soon as you establish your group identity and the people you care about and what your values are, you look naturally to who's going to threaten you, and you stand up for those. So looking at that more abstractly with myself, I started to see how socially it made sense. It can play out simply in being, connected to certain intellectual traditions that now you find dominance within that. And it's still 8. There's still the same other fixations going on beneath the surface. So I hope that makes sense with the instincts, because it really is something innate about your functioning. When you look at yourself overall, here's what you're doing. And it's not the priorities. I think that the priorities, people would almost always have something completely different, with maybe some exceptions, but that explains why people waffle and struggle with it and argue about it too. I think that for priorities, I'm like an SXSP. Because the social stuff, it's like water to me. I mean, I can make friends, I have 1 million group memberships, but if I go with that as my stacking, I run into problems. If I go with sexual suffering as my stacking, because rewind to 3-4 years ago, I'm mostly happily married. I've got a kid, I've got a job, I've got a lot of SP stability in place. My health is decent, but it has slipped. Things have slipped there. And, I'm a little bit dissatisfied with the marriage, and SXF's not coming together, but I find myself wanting to start groups, randomly. I start going out to groups. I'm driven by wanting to buy a new piano, because now I have resources, and my ex-wife's telling me that we can afford one and stuff like this. So I'm now going out to piano gatherings and making friends, making friends with concert pianists and teachers and the like. Not because I'm trying to have sex with them. It's because I'm already in a relationship. I'm not looking for that, but I naturally make friends. And then I start my own group, and I become a group leader, and I naturally make more friends because I'm able to tap into that culture and that, collective, values. And it just makes sense that I end up having a social instinct. One clue is that once in the marriage and with the kid, I started craving connection to more groups and started taking the other stuff for granted. I think that we take for granted what we earn in the other spaces because we have a kind of a blind spot to both of them. Even to the secondary, we have kind of a blind spot. I'd be sitting around in my marriage and think, oh yeah, I've got that taken care of. Now I'm going to go and look at, puzzles or read or work or, do this other music for hours and not even think about that, and just thinking I have it nailed down, because marriage again is a form of commitment. So that's something also probably more in the SO space of, you just trust the culture, the tradition, the structure that's there. And I found myself doing more and more stuff in the intellectual space and also connecting with social groups. So for me, it made sense once I started to look for it more honestly. Part of it had to do with some rules of thumb that I like, that I think work. Again, this countertypes, non-countertypes thing, you have to see how they're logical. Women are a little bit different, because with the 8s, female 8s are often mistyped by other people and are disregarded and discredited, and hey, are you really an 8? You don't look like an 8. And it's because of the patriarchal thing in our society, and the 8 descriptions favor a tough, aggressive guy, and it's very masculine, and the women, female 8s, often aren't as much like that. Okay, so female 8s, they can be mistyped, and the sexual as well as any, but with men, the male sexual 8s are more often recognizable as an 8. For females, look more for surrender, but for the 8s, the men look more for possession and kind of your classic, up, strong, standing, tough, confident, assertive guy, and they're more commanding, and they can be recognized more easily as an 8. They look a little bit more like the SP8. These two are both more recognizable. And then the social 8 really is the countertype. And it follows from the instincts and how the instincts operate within the personality. It doesn't have to do with the priorities, but once you understand the instincts and the countertypes and the protypes, subtypes, you'll see that it's all very logical. And people that disagree with it are getting hung up on like one part of the description, and you just can't do that. You have to see how the concept was built and how it's better to absorb it. This is an intellectual system. This is something for you to learn, to internalize, so that you can then use it in your own life. If you're now challenging it every step of the way, it reminds me of when I was in philosophy class in college, and the kid in the front row would always be going, "Oh, well, I don't agree with that, professor. I don't agree with that, professor." And the guy knows the material like the back of his hand. And I just sat there and rolled my eyes like, are you seriously right now? Because this is so ridiculous. Get over yourself. You're, arrogant, you're silly. What's with your ego? Do you really think that you're telling the professor anything he doesn't know? And when people contradict some of the core theory and say, "Well, I don't agree with I don't agree with subtypes, or I don't think countertypes makes any sense," and you don't realize that that is so absurd on a basic propositional level. I mean, I can understand taking issue with some small things about it, but that's like saying I don't agree with some other core theory. Granted, it's not as elementary as, say, the three instincts or the three triads. It's still along those lines. And to then say you like stackings, and because subtype is just putting a name to what you would see. Maybe you don't like the precise names, but you have to see how the concept operates and how it simply is the core type, the instinct, the passion channeled into the dominant instinct. And if you look at it basically the way that the early guys were looking at it, you should also see some variation of it. I think people get way too caught up in, oh, well, no, it's not that, and they end up misstacking themselves often. They end up going by priorities. And a lot of people want to be asexual because we all love sex. It feels so good, and we love relationships. People are social creatures, all of us, and we all love, the granddaddy of all relationships are our soulmate, right? Everybody wants that, I think. It's just, but we're not all sexual subtypes. Sexual subtypes, again, they have more of a drive there, that they show action. They work towards it more, and they get into more relationships more easily. They know what to do more quickly. They're more comfortable to dive right in. And they have that innate proficiency and knack and more comfort there. I think some people are sexual last, and they have convinced themselves they're sexual first because they care so much about it, and they're like struggling to find it, and they can't make it work, and they're agonizing over it, and they're depressed, and it's because they just aren't a sexual subtype. They need to look a little bit more how to hone that instinct and what's really, if they want that so much, accept that they're not an SX first, that they really don't have the instinct for it. They want it and they feel it, and we all know what it's like to be in love and to fall, unless we're asexual, but we all know what it's like, and it's amazing. And that's the most important thing in our lives, often for many of us. Sometimes people will go with SP because that's so basic and we just survive. But oftentimes people will say, my partner, my boyfriend, girlfriend, my close, intimate other. Sometimes they'll say my kids and my family, but interestingly, that also connects to the sexual instinct, because it started by the sexual instinct. So these are important theoretical things to get right. People like to argue with me and don't realize how much time and effort and energy I put into this. And I admit I can be inconsistent over time. People that follow me are probably pissed. Like, well, look, this is new. I mean, you were always talking about me. I've been a little bit inconsistent, and it's annoying. But I feel that lately more pieces have been falling into place with me recently, and it's kind of a headache, when you get somebody that's been doing this for a long time, and they were in some rather toxic groups and closed-minded groups, and I learned a great deal about how people operate, but I also was gaslighted about my type and was, at least partially mistyped for some of it. And the times that I held my genuine type, I didn't have the instinct right, and I wasn't forthcoming about my self-typing, which led me then to relapse later on and say, well, that couldn't have been right. So the Enneagram is very much about self-awareness. If you don't get it right at some point, then you're not going to benefit as much from this thing. And it can't be determined by other people. It just can't. There's no, if you do that, you simply are not going to get the right type, the right stacking. The idea is to get the proper one, and it's often not the one you want initially. Early on, I thought it would be really cool to be the 5 because they're geniuses, and now I've come to see that more as probably something with the social instinct, that I want to have position and status and intellectual, power and so forth. It's not, that's a stereotype that the 5s are the genius, and people have cherry-picked geniuses in history that are likely 5s, and kind of the archetypal genius often is, but you can get somebody that's extremely smart of any type. So we need to let go of some of these stereotypes. Some of the smartest people I've known in the typology community were other types, were 1s or 8s or whatever, right? It's just, and in real life too, the 7s have a reputation for being geniuses. Feynman was a 7, and it's a lot of stereotypes. And for individual people, regular folks like us, you can't think in those terms. You have to look at how it operates in your life with your relationships and who you know and who you connect with in your life story. You can't deal in stereotypes of, well, I'm real smart, so I'm probably going to be a 5 or 6. It's just, that's not what it's about. It's not actually about that stuff. There can be a loose correlation, but it's not precisely that. It's not that if you're smart, you're a 5, a 6, or 7. If you're heady and intellectual and smart, it's not. Although there can be correlation, it's not precisely that. There are a lot of exceptions. And I've known a self-preservation 8 that was brilliant intellectually and, heady and all of that. But you have other fixes, and you have other elements, and you have wings, and you have lines and paths and so forth, and it's just not. I think some people look at this the wrong way, and I know they do because I've done it. And that's all there is to it. So I hope I don't come across as too arrogant or lectury or something with this. I'm just trying to explain to people what I've learned that's objective, theoretical information. I think that people often don't process, and then they kind of don't do the derivations, and I'm now seeing more of the derivations and the manifestations in my life and how it plays out, and how, I would recommend finding people who are really good contrasting examples of people in your life. Like, finally seeing my brother as a sexual 8 made so much more sense. I had him as a self-pres. That made it easy for me to contrastively be a sexual 8. That fell into place for me. Whereas once I finally saw him as a sexual, then I realized that it was much less likely that I was a sexual, because we're quite different, and so on and so forth. So this is to help people. This is not, if you have it all figured out, just ignore me, okay? Listen to what I'm saying, and if you want to go by it, then go by it. If you don't, then don't. This is for people that don't have it figured out and want to know and are still confused and are looking for this. Look for the tendency, your actions, what you do naturally, often unconsciously, and look for a knack, look for a talent, look for doing too much of it, and for being better than average at it, and look for precisely what it is and how it isn't just a specific thing, but that it has a particular way that it operates. The more automatic SP, the more learned SO, and the more kind of instantaneous, back and forth of the sexual, this polarity and so on and so forth. I could talk a lot about the instincts, and it's a pretty important aspect of Enneagram theory. And when my book is done, there will be a restatement of some of this, and there will be a lengthy section on it, but I'll go into more of it probably in the second book, because that's when the modern theorists took subtypes, concepts, and stackings came about and everything. So I'm not going to go into it in full depth in book 1. Okay, thank you so much. I hope that you have a nice day.